My name is Sandra, and I'm 44 years old. For most of my life, I wore a uniform that taught me how to stand tall, keep calm under fire, and fight for what mattered. After 20 years in the military, I thought I'd left that part of me behind. I traded my boots for gardening gloves, my early morning drills for quiet cups of coffee on the porch. Life was peaceful, ordinary, and I was grateful for it. But peace can be fragile, and sometimes, it shatters in a single heartbeat. That heartbeat came the moment my daughter, Becca, appeared on my doorstep one rainy afternoon. I remember the sound first, her hesitant knock. I opened the door and saw her standing there, drenched, trembling, and with a look in her eyes I'll never forget. It wasn't just fear, it was defeat. Her right cheek was swollen, the faint outline of a bruise blooming beneath her makeup. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. "Mom," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He hit me." Those 3 words ripped through me like shrapnel. My mind, my body, everything inside me switched into another mode. One I hadn't needed in years. Training, instinct, focus. But beneath it all, there was pain raw, maternal pain that no battlefield had ever prepared me for. I pulled her inside and wrapped her in a blanket. She tried to apologize for coming over unannounced, but I hushed her. I made her tea, sat her down, and just listened. The details came out slowly, painfully. Eric, her husband of barely 2 years, had lost his temper again. It started as shouting, then pushing, and finally, it crossed a line he could never uncross. As she spoke, my mind flashed back to the first time I met Eric. He had seemed charming, respectful, even shy. The kind of man who opened doors and remembered birthdays. At their wedding, he held Becca's hand like she was made of glass. I remember telling myself she was lucky. I remember thinking he reminded me of her father. Back when we were young. I was wrong. In the months after their marriage, Becca had grown quieter. Her calls home became shorter. She brushed off my questions with phrases like, "He's just stressed," or, "It's been a rough week." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think she was just adjusting to married life. But now, as I looked at her trembling hands and tear-streaked face, I realized how much I'd missed. When she finally stopped talking, I asked the question that had been burning in my chest. "Has this happened before?" Her silence told me everything I needed to know. I felt a surge of heat in my veins, a kind of controlled fury I hadn't felt since my last command mission. Back then, it had been directed at enemies I didn't know. Now, it was aimed squarely at a man I once called son. Becca grabbed my hand, sensing the storm building inside me. "Mom, please. Don't do anything, I just need to be safe." Her words anchored me. The soldier in me wanted to act now, decisively, but the mother in me knew this wasn't a battlefield I could charge into blindly. I nodded slowly, squeezing her hand. "You're safe here, that's all that matters right now," she cried again, this time not from fear, but from relief. I helped her settle in the guest room that night, made sure the doors were locked, and stayed awake long after she fell asleep. The rain kept falling outside, tapping against the windows like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. I sat there, staring at the faint glow of the lamp, thinking about everything my training had taught me: discipline, patience, strategy. You don't engage until you know your terrain, your enemy, and your objective. That mindset had saved lives before and now. It was the only thing keeping me from driving to Eric's house that very night. Instead, I pulled out an old wooden box from my closet. Inside were pieces of my past dog tags, faded photos, medals, and, at the very bottom, the folded fabric of my old uniform. I hadn't touched it in years. As I unfolded it, the scent of starch and leather filled the room. My fingers traced the patches, the stitching, the name tag. Captain S. Miles. I thought about the woman who used to wear this, strong, steady, unafraid. I realized that woman wasn't gone, she was just dormant. I glanced toward the hallway, where Becca slept peacefully for the first time in months. My daughter had survived a war of her own, one fought behind closed doors and silent cries. And now, she needed a soldier again, not the kind who fired weapons, but the kind who fought smart, quiet, and without mercy when justice demanded it. I folded the uniform neatly and placed it on the chair beside me. I didn't know exactly what I would do yet, but I knew this. Eric had no idea who he was dealing with. The rain outside turned to thunder, rumbling low in the distance, and I took it as a sign. My days of peace were over. That night, I opened my closet and stared at my old uniform, feeling the weight of the mission I was about to undertake. It had been nearly 20 years since I last wore that uniform, but my hands remembered every button and patch. The next morning, I stood in front of the mirror, the early light cutting through the blinds, and buttoned the fabric that once defined my life. The uniform still fit, maybe a little snug around the shoulders, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the feeling, the grounding weight of purpose. I had been many things in my life. A soldier, a wife, a mother. But that morning, I became something else entirely, a protector ready to act. Becca was still asleep when I started cleaning the kitchen, the steady rhythm of habit keeping my thoughts from spiraling. I replayed her words from the night before, every trembling confession, every apology she shouldn't have had to make. Eric had stripped her confidence one argument at a time. I'd seen it happen to other women in the service, the slow erosion of self-worth under someone's control, but I had never imagined I'd see it in my own daughter. When Becca woke, she found me sitting at the table with a notebook. I had already started outlining what I called Operation Justice, Old Habits Die Hard. I listed everything I knew about Eric, his job as a financial consultant, his office location, his friends, his routines. Information was power, and if there was one thing the military had taught me, it was that you don't win a battle without knowing your enemy. Becca sat across from me, her hands cupped around a steaming mug of coffee. "Mom, what are you doing?" "Planning," I said simply. Her eyes widened. "You promised you wouldn't do anything reckless." I met her gaze. "And I won't. But if we're going to protect you, we need to be smart. You taught me to think things through, remember?" That made her smile faintly. She had always been the calm one, the voice of reason, even as a child. But now, I needed her to see that calmness could coexist with strength. I spent the rest of that day collecting what I could. Becca showed me her phone, dozens of unread messages from Eric, ranging from desperate apologies to angry rants. The pattern was clear: manipulation through guilt and fear. I told her to save everything. We would need it. Later that afternoon, while she rested, I drove into town. I parked a few blocks from Eric's office and watched from across the street. He came out around 5:30, phone in hand, laughing with a coworker like he didn't have a care in the world. There was no remorse in his face, no sign of the man who had left bruises on my daughter's skin. That calm fury inside me deepened. I memorized his car, his license plate, even the route he took when he left. I didn't follow him yet. I just observed. Observation, after all, was the first step to control. That night, when I got home, Becca looked more like herself. She had eaten dinner, showered, and even smiled a little when I teased her about stealing my blanket, but I could still see the haunted look in her eyes whenever her phone buzzed. She flinched every time. I told her to turn it off. Before she went to bed, she hesitated at my door. "Mom, I don't want to make things worse. I just want it to be over." I stood and put my hands on her shoulders. "Sweetheart, this ends when you're free, not when he says it's over. Do you understand?" She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes, and went to bed. When I was sure she was asleep, I made a call I hadn't made in years. The number was still memorized, though I hadn't dialed it since my retirement. "Naomi Parker," came the voice on the other end, firm, familiar, and laced with the same calm authority I remembered. "Hey, Parker," I said softly. A pause. Then, a chuckle. "Sandra Miles, haven't heard that call sign in a long time. You sound serious." "I am," I replied. "I need your help." There was no hesitation. "Tell me what's going on." I told her everything about Becca, about Eric, about what he'd done. Naomi didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she let out a slow breath. "You always did pick your battles carefully," she said. "Count me in." That night, we met at an old diner outside town, just like old times. I laid out what I knew, and Naomi listened, her sharp mind already working through angles and contingencies. She'd spent her post-service years in private security, so I knew I was in good hands. First rule, she said, stirring her coffee, don't make it obvious. Men like him thrive on control. You take that away piece by piece until he unravels himself. I nodded. We'll make him paranoid. Naomi smirked. You always were the strategist. By the time we left the diner, we had a plan, a way to shake Eric to his core without ever laying a hand on him. This wouldn't be revenge, it would be education. When I returned home, the she just cost per medication. The clock read past midnight. Becca's door was closed, the faint sound of her breathing steady through the wall. I sat on the couch and looked at the folded uniform draped over the armrest. For years, I had thought that chapter of my life was over. But it wasn't. That uniform wasn't just cloth, it was armor. And now, it had a new mission. The more I uncovered, the darker the picture became, and the angrier I grew. When I learned what he did to his previous girlfriend, I knew Eric's reckoning was long overdue. It had been nearly 20 years since I last wore that uniform, but my hands remembered every button and patch. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror the next morning, sunlight barely cutting through the curtains, and stared at the reflection of a woman I thought I'd left behind. The uniform still carried the faint scent of starch and discipline. As I buttoned it, muscle memory took over, precise, deliberate, automatic. My reflection didn't look like a mother anymore. It looked like a soldier. The moment I finished adjusting my collar, I heard the creak of the floorboards. Becca stood in the doorway, still wrapped in her robe, her eyes red from crying through the night. Her expression was a mix of confusion and fear. "Mom, what are you doing?" she asked softly. I met her gaze in the mirror. "Remembering who I am," I said. She shook her head, stepping forward. "You don't need to do this. I don't want you to get in trouble because of me." I turned and placed a hand on her cheek, the unbruised one. "Honey, I'm not going to do anything stupid. But I am going to make sure you're never hurt again. That's a promise." Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. I could tell she didn't fully believe me, not yet. After breakfast, while Becca sat in the living room quietly scrolling through her phone, I pulled out an old leather notebook and began to write. Years of command briefings had trained me to think in came. Steps, objectives, reconnaissance, engagement. The mission was simple in theory, but complex in execution. Protect Becca, expose Eric, and ensure he never had power over her again. I started with what I knew: his job, his routines, his personality. Becca told me everything she could remember. He worked as a financial advisor at a mid-sized firm downtown. He played basketball on Wednesdays with coworkers, visited his parents once a month, and had drinks at a local bar most Fridays. But what caught my attention most wasn't his schedule, it was how controlled he was. Becca described how he tracked her phone, questioned every dollar she spent, and had gradually cut her off from her friends. Classic control tactics, the kind used by manipulators and predators who hid behind charm. "Did he ever threaten you?" I asked. She hesitated. "Not directly, but once, when I tried to leave after an argument, he said if I walked out that door, I'd regret it." His voice, it scared me. I clenched my pen so tightly it nearly snapped. I had to take a deep breath before answering. "You won't ever go back there," I told her firmly. "Not for any reason." That afternoon, I started my own kind of reconnaissance. I drove to Eric's office, parking across the street. My military instincts returned instantly. Observe, assess, and record. I watched him leave for lunch, laughing with two coworkers. From a distance, he looked harmless, polished even. The kind of man who could fool anyone. That was what made him dangerous. He didn't notice me. He didn't notice much at all. Predators rarely look for threats outside their prey. When I returned home, I called an old friend from my service days, Naomi Holt. We'd trained together back when we were both young and thought we could fix the world. After leaving the military, she'd gone into private security consulting. If anyone could help me handle this situation the right way, it was her. She answered on the second ring. "Sandra Miles." Haven't heard your voice in forever. What's going on? There was no point sugarcoating it. I told her everything. Every word trembled with restraint, but I got through it. Naomi didn't interrupt, though I could hear her steady breathing on the other end. When I finished, there was a long pause. Finally, she said, you need eyes on him and proof. You know the system without it, they'll twist the story. I know, I said. That's why I'm calling you. By nightfall, Naomi was at my house, standing in my living room with that same no-nonsense stance she'd always had. She wore jeans and a jacket, but her presence filled the room like we were back in a briefing tent. Let's get to work, she said simply. We spent hours talking strategy. Naomi suggested setting up surveillance, nothing illegal, just smart observation, cameras, logs, timestamps. Every time Eric contacted Becca, we'd document it. Every threatening message would be backed up twice. Men like him trip over their own arrogance, she said. You don't need to fight him, you just let him expose himself. I nodded, absorbing every word. For the first time in days, I felt control returning to my hands. Not violence control. The distinction mattered. That night, after Naomi left, I checked on Becca. She was asleep, finally resting without tears. I stood in her doorway and watched her for a moment. She looked so young, so small in that moment. A part of me ached with guilt that I hadn't seen the signs earlier. But guilt was a luxury I couldn't afford. I returned to my room, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at my uniform hanging over the chair. I hadn't worn it in battle for years, but the memories clung to it, like dust missions completed, soldiers lost, lessons learned. I remembered my commanding officer once telling me, sometimes, the fight you don't want finds you anyway. He was right. I took off the uniform carefully and folded it again, placing it within arm's reach. I wasn't sure when I'd need it next, but I knew that time was coming. I could feel it in my gut, the same instinct that had saved my life more than once. I turned off the light and lay in bed, listening to the quiet hum of the house. My daughter was safe for now. But I knew Eric wouldn't stay silent for long. Men like him rarely did. The more I uncovered, the darker the picture became, and the angrier I grew. When I learned what he did to his previous girlfriend, I knew Eric's reckoning was long overdue. Eric wasn't just cruel, he was a pattern of cruelty wrapped in charm. After Naomi left that night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the living room, the glow of my laptop screen reflecting off the window as I dug deeper into Eric's past. His social media was clean, too clean. The kind of curated perfection that people like him often used to hide behind. Family photos, company outings, romantic anniversary posts. Every image screamed normal. But I'd learned long ago that normal often hides the most rot beneath the surface. I went further back, older posts, tagged pictures from friends, and finally, names I didn't recognize. That's when I saw her. A young woman named Jenna. Her account had gone inactive years ago. But something about the photos caught my attention. She looked happy, but there was something guarded in her smile. She appeared in Eric's old photos for almost 2 years then. Suddenly, she was gone. No explanation, no posts about a breakup, just silence. My gut tightened. I'd seen patterns like this before. I clicked through what few public posts she had left, and one comment from a friend stood out. Hope you're safe, Jenna. You deserve peace. That was enough for me to know there was more to her story. I spent the next morning tracking her down. It took hours of digging through local directories and a few discreet favors from old contacts. When I finally found an address tied to her name, different last name now, in another state, I hesitated. I didn't want to reopen her trauma, but I needed to know the truth. That evening, I made the call. My voice was steady, even though my heart pounded in my chest. Jenna, my name is Sandra Miles. You don't know me, but I believe we have something in common, someone actually, Eric. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I thought she might hang up. Then I heard her inhale sharply. How do you know Eric? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. My daughter was married to him, I said carefully. She's safe now. But he hurt her. I need to understand who he really is. Her voice broke as she whispered, "He hurt me too." That one sentence confirmed everything I already suspected but still hoped wasn't true. Over the next half hour, Jenna told me her story. It started the same way: flowers, compliments, a whirlwind of affection that made her feel cherished. Then came the control. The questions about where she was going, who she was with, what she was wearing. Eventually, it turned violent. She said the last night they were together, he'd thrown a glass across the room because dinner wasn't hot enough. She ran that night and never looked back. She didn't press charges because she was terrified. He'd told her that if she ever spoke up, he'd make sure no one believed her. I thanked her for her courage and promised her that this time, things would be different. Before we hung up, she said, "If I'd known he'd moved on and married someone else, I would have warned her. I'm so sorry." Her words echoed in my mind for hours. It wasn't her fault, it was his. It was always his. When I told Naomi what I'd found, her response was simple but sharp. "We've got a pattern now, that's enough to bury him." We decided to build a solid foundation of evidence. I backed up all the texts Becca had saved. We saved recordings of his calls, threats, apologies, and manipulative pleas. Every time he reached out, I documented it. Every word he spoke became another brick in the wall closing in on him. But something shifted in me that day. I stopped thinking like a mother reacting to pain, and started thinking like the soldier I used to be, calculated, precise, and patient. I wasn't going to rush into confrontation. I wanted Eric to crumble under the weight of his own actions. A few days later, Naomi came by with a folder full of background checks and public records. She dropped it on my kitchen table with a thud. "You were right," she said. "He's clean on paper, but look here." Inside were records of police calls from his old neighborhood. Disturbances. Noise complaints. One incident listed as domestic argument, but no charges were filed. The date matched the week Jenna said she left him. We had confirmation. "Men like him don't stop," Naomi said. "They just move on to new victims. You're doing the right thing." I nodded, though my stomach churned. Doing the right thing didn't always feel good. It felt heavy, necessary, but heavy. That night, Becca came to me holding her phone. "He called again," she whispered. Her voice trembled. "He said he's sorry and that he wants to talk." "Did you answer?" I asked. She shook her head. "I didn't have to. Hearing his voice on voicemail was enough." I took her phone gently. "Good, we'll keep it. Everything he says, every word, it's evidence now." I could see the relief in her eyes when she realized this wasn't just about fear anymore. We were fighting back, in our own way. Later, when she went to bed, I opened my notebook again. Phase 2, I wrote across the top. It was time to let Eric know he wasn't untouchable, that the woman he thought he broke had a mother who refused to be broken. I looked at the uniform folded neatly on my chair. It wasn't just fabric anymore, it was a reminder of who I was when the world demanded strength. Together, Naomi and I plotted a strategy that would shake Eric to his core without breaking the law. By the time Eric saw me again, he wouldn't recognize the calm mother-in-law he thought he could intimidate. The first phase of the plan began with fear his own. I remember the way Naomi's eyes narrowed when I told her I wanted to make Eric feel watched without ever touching him. "Psychological pressure," she said, folding her hands like she was already running a mission brief. "We'll make him paranoid, small things that erode control. He'll turn inward and reveal himself." I liked the simplicity of it. Simple moves, surgical in effect. No theatrics, no illegal tricks, just the slow dismantling of a man who believed his charm put him beyond consequence. We started with the envelope. Late one night, Naomi drove us to his neighborhood while I sat in the passenger seat, pulse steady, uniform hidden beneath a civilian coat. She handed me a plain, unmarked envelope with photos inside, pictures Naomi had taken from a distance. Eric's raised hand in mid-argument, his shadow looming over Becca, the look in his eyes when he shouted. The photos were grainy but damning. I walked up his front steps, heart steady, and left it tucked under the mat like a ghostly messenger. On top, I placed a single typed sentence. "We see you." No signature, no threat, just observation. It worked faster than I expected. Within 48 hours, I started noticing changes. His co-workers who once shared morning coffees now avoided conversations about family. He began driving different routes and checking his mirrors more frequently. Naomi and I took to parking near his office at random times, just to keep the pressure consistent. A car lingered outside his favorite bar for a few hours on a Friday. A note with no return address arrived on the windshield. He found small things, then started finding nothing at all, and that uncertainty eats at a man who thrives on control. At home, Becca's shoulders relaxed a fraction. She slept deeper, laughed more, let the weight of constant vigilance drop a degree. That was the point. We were not trying to terrify her further. We were stripping his ability to intimidate. Each time he misstepped, we logged it. Times he called, the content of his messages, the times he appeared outside their old apartment building. Everything went into a folder labeled facts. Naomi taught me how to timestamp and back up files in 3 different places. Evidence, she reminded me, is a weapon that never rusts. There were moments my conscience whispered that we were crossing a line. I silenced it the way I had silenced fear on deployments, by focusing on the mission's objective: safety for my daughter. The plan had rules: no vandalism, no physical confrontation, no outright lies. We would not become what we fought. That ethical boundary kept me from sliding into vindictiveness. It also made our moves surgical and defensible. As the days went by, Eric's calls to Becca shifted tone: less abusive bravado and more pleading, fragmented apologies that tried to mask threats in sweetness. We recorded every voicemail and screenshot every text. Naomi set up small, unobtrusive cameras at strategic angles where legally permissible near public entrances. At the perimeter of his property, nothing inside his home. Nothing that would give them legal cause to accuse us. The aim was to create a trail he couldn't deny. One evening, he left a message directly on Becca's phone, voice low and shaky. "You promised you'd stay." She didn't answer. She forwarded the voicemail to me. I listened to it once, twice, and then uploaded it to 3 separate cloud accounts. My hands didn't shake. They remembered steadiness. For the first time since this began, I felt we had leverage. Not to humiliate, but to protect. We used small public confrontations as a test. Naomi ordered lunch at the cafe where he sometimes met clients. I sat across the street in plain view. He glanced up, saw someone watching, and then rushed his coffee, leaving behind a napkin with his fingerprints. It was trivial and petty, but it added to the narrative he would eventually have to explain. Paranoia is cumulative. It doesn't need a showdown to topple a man who believes he is untouchable. As our pressure mounted, he made a mistake that neither of us anticipated. He started showing up at our house not to beg or apologize so much as to scare. One night he paced the sidewalk, muttering threats into his phone. Naomi caught the whole thing on her recorder. When I watched the footage later, I saw the arrogance in his gait crack into something raw and animal. That crack told me everything I needed to know. He was unraveling. The community around us began to sense the shift. A neighbor who'd once waved politely now locked her door when he drove by. A barista who'd once chatted with him offered Becca an extra pastry and a smile. Small acts of solidarity matter. They change the landscape of isolation abusers rely on. We started quietly telling people a version of the truth that emphasized protection, how to reach out, how to call the police if they saw something. No drama, just facts and options. By the time we executed the next step, sending him a recorded voicemail of his own threats, compiled and edited, to his workplace email, he was already off balance. He listened to his own voice, layered with timestamps and dates, then looked up as if the room had shifted. His colleagues asked questions. He made excuses that rang hollow. The dominoes began to fall not because of one loud event, but because his choices had been documented and shared in ways he never imagined. By the time Eric saw me again, he wouldn't recognize the calm mother-in-law he thought he could intimidate. The more I pushed, the more desperate Eric became. The weeks following, our psychological campaign tested every ounce of restraint I had left. Eric's paranoia grew like mold, quietly at first, then everywhere. He stopped showing up regularly at work, changed his phone number twice, and even called Becca's old friends, demanding to know if they'd been spying on him. The irony would have been almost funny if it weren't so dangerous. Then, one late afternoon, I heard the gravel crunch outside my house. I looked through the window and saw his car pulling into the driveway. My chest went still, like my body remembered combat without the sound of gunfire. Becca, sitting on the couch, froze too. "Mom," she whispered, "he found us." I stood slowly, steadying my voice. "Go to the guest room, lock the door and stay there." She did as I said, disappearing down the hallway without another word. I walked to the closet near the front door and, without hesitation, pulled out the garment bag that held my uniform. This wasn't vanity, it was armor. I slipped it on, piece by piece, each movement deliberate. The metals pinned to my chest caught the faint afternoon light. When I looked at myself in the mirror by the door, I didn't see fear. I saw readiness. The knocking began hard, fast, impatient. "Open the door, Sandra." Eric's voice boomed. "I know she's here. I just want to talk." Talk. That word, coming from him, felt like a threat wrapped in deceit. I opened the door just enough to face him. His face was red, his jaw tight, and his eyes darted between me and the small gap in the door. "Where's Becca?" he demanded. "She doesn't want to see you," I said evenly. "You need to leave." He tried to push the door open, but I stood my ground. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," he snapped. "She's my wife." "Not for long," I replied. That was when he saw the uniform. His expression faltered, the arrogance draining from his face. He stepped back, blinking, confused. "What is this? Some kind of act?" "No act," I said. "You're standing on my property, threatening my daughter. You should leave before this becomes something more serious." He tried to laugh it off, but it came out forced. "You think that uniform scares me?" I took one step forward. "No. But what it represents should." For a moment, we just stared at each other. The silence between us was taut, electric. I could see the calculations flickering behind his eyes. The tiny realization that he no longer controlled this situation. I didn't need to yell or threaten. The uniform, my composure, the quiet authority they spoke louder than any weapon. "You think you can keep her away from me forever?" he hissed. I didn't answer. Instead, I held his gaze and said in a low voice, "You've got exactly 10 seconds to get off my property before I call the police." 10, 9. He hesitated, his nostrils flaring, before finally turning and storming back to his car. The tires screeched as he sped down the road. I stood there until the sound of his engine faded completely. When I finally exhaled, Becca emerged from the hallway, tears welling in her eyes. "Mom, you shouldn't have done that," she said, trembling. "He's going to get angrier." "He's already angry," I said. "But now he's scared, and that's the difference." That night, Naomi came over and helped me review the footage. Her camera, hidden discreetly near the porch, had captured everything: his aggression, his words, his attempt to force entry. We had visual proof now, irrefutable and time-stamped. "This is gold," Naomi said. "We hand this to the authorities, and he won't get near her again." I nodded, but I didn't feel triumphant. My body still hummed with adrenaline. When you've been in danger before, your instincts remember the rhythm of survival. I knew Eric wasn't finished, not yet. 2 days later, Becca tried to go back to work. She texted me at lunch, saying she was fine, that her coworkers had been supportive. But by evening, she called, her voice tight with fear. "Mom, his car was parked outside the parking lot. I didn't see him. But I know it was him." I told her to come straight home. When she arrived, Naomi was already there, reviewing paperwork for a restraining order. It was time to make this official. We gathered all our evidence, the recordings, photos, texts, everything, and organized it into a single chronological report. I wanted the police to have no doubts, no gaps. We drove to the precinct the next morning, Becca clutching my hand the entire way. The officer who took our statement was patient and thorough. When he finished reviewing the files, he looked up at me and said, "You did everything right, ma'am. This will hold up." That night, Becca slept for the first time without waking in a panic. I sat outside on the porch, uniform folded beside me, watching the moonlight ripple across the yard. I should have felt relief, but something gnawed at me, a sense that the calm was temporary. People like Eric didn't surrender, they plotted. That footage would be the final piece I needed to bring him down legally. But before I could hand it to the police, Eric disappeared. For 3 days, Eric was nowhere to be found, and that scared me more than anything. After the encounter at my front door, I expected retaliation. Men like Eric didn't just vanish quietly. They brooded, they planned, they lashed out. But for 3 long days, there was nothing, no calls, no texts, no sightings. It was the kind of silence that doesn't soothe. It hums beneath your skin like the quiet before an explosion. Becca tried to convince herself it was over. She wanted to believe that maybe the restraining order, the fear in his eyes when he saw my uniform, had been enough to keep him away. She cooked breakfast, made phone calls, and even managed to smile. But I could see the unease behind it. She was waiting for the other shoe to drop, and so was I. Naomi and I met in the backyard one evening as the sun set. "Too quiet," she said, her voice low. "He's regrouping." "I know," I replied, keeping my eyes on the tree line at the edge of the property. "He's not done. He's figuring out his next move." Naomi crossed her arms. "Then we stay one step ahead. I've already upgraded your cameras. Motion detection, night vision. Everything uploads directly to the cloud." Her preparation brought me some comfort, but my instincts were still on high alert. I'd spent too many years reading danger in the quiet. Still, I tried not to let Becca see my worry. She needed to believe in stability, even if I didn't. That night, just after midnight, I heard the low hum of an engine outside. I rose from bed silently, careful not to wake Becca. Peeking through the curtain, I saw headlights parked across the street. The car didn't move. It just idled there. Engine running. Lights dim. Naomi's voice echoed in my mind. "They always test boundaries before they strike." I grabbed my flashlight, slipped on my boots, and took a slow breath. My heart rate was steady, not from calm, but from control. I stepped outside, the gravel crunching beneath my feet. The air was cold and still. As I took one step toward the street, the car suddenly reversed, headlights flaring, and sped off into the night. I caught a partial plate number enough to recognize it was Eric's car. When I came back inside, I locked the door and sat at the table, forcing myself to think like a tactician, not a mother. Fear clouds judgment. Information saves lives. The next morning, I called Naomi and told her everything. She didn't even hesitate. "He's probing," she said. "He wants to see how far he can push before you react. Don't engage, just document." So, that's what we did. We gathered stills from the camera footage and sent them to my contact at the Veterans Association, Lieutenant Harris, now working with local law enforcement. He was one of the few people I trusted completely. When I told him what was happening, he said, "Sandra, bring me everything. I'll make sure it's on record." I delivered the files that afternoon, photos of Eric outside our house, the threatening voicemails, his earlier outburst on the porch. Harris nodded as he flipped through the documents. "This is solid," he said. "But if he's escalating, you need to prepare for the possibility he'll do something reckless." "I already am," I said quietly. When I returned home, Becca was in the kitchen making tea. She looked up and smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Any word?" "Nothing yet," I said. "But we're not taking chances. Harris has everything. We're covered." She nodded, though I could tell she was fighting to believe it. That night, we triple-checked the locks. Naomi stayed over, sleeping on the couch with her firearm licensed and holstered beside her. The house felt like a fortress, and still, I couldn't shake the unease. At dawn, the sound of breaking glass shattered the fragile peace. I rushed outside to find Becca's car vandalized. The windshield was cracked clean across, the paint keyed down both sides. My stomach dropped when I saw the note taped to the driver's side window, scrawled in black marker. "You can't protect her forever." Becca came running out behind me, hands over her mouth as she stared at the wreckage. "Oh my God, Mom, he was here." I turned the note over in my hand, my fingers tightening. "Yes," I said evenly, And now we have proof he violated the restraining order. Naomi came out moments later, already snapping pictures of the damage. This is it, she said. He's officially lost control. We spent the next hour filing another police report. The officer who arrived recognized me immediately from Harris's referral. We'll send someone to keep an eye on the neighborhood, he said, but I could tell from his tone that he'd seen this pattern before. Paper protections only went so far. When the officer left, Becca broke down. He won't stop, Mom. He'll just keep coming until he gets what he wants. I took her by the shoulders, steadying her trembling hands. Then we make sure what he wants is impossible to get. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my uniform again, watching the security feeds flicker on the monitor Naomi had set up. Every movement outside caught my eye. Every shift in the shadows made my pulse quicken. But beneath that vigilance was something else: resolve. I had fought enemies with clearer motives than Eric. I had faced fear in open combat. But this was personal. This was a war I hadn't chosen, but one I would win nonetheless. I knew one truth from my years of service. An aggressor's power comes from your fear of what he might do next. Take that away, and he's just a man. I wasn't afraid anymore. But the next morning, the situation escalated beyond anything I'd prepared for. Becca's car was found vandalized with a note taped to the windshield. You can't protect her forever. That note was the declaration of war I'd been waiting for. I held the crumpled paper in my hand long after the officers left, staring at the words until they blurred into smudged lines. You can't protect her forever. It wasn't just a threat, it was a challenge. And I had never been one to back down from a challenge. The mother in me wanted to cry, to hide Becca somewhere safe and beg the world to leave her alone. But the soldier in me, the one who had been forged through years of discipline and control, refused to cower. This was the moment I stopped reacting and started commanding. I turned to Naomi, who was pacing by the window, eyes scanning the street. He's escalating. It's only a matter of time before he tries to break in again. She nodded grimly. Then we don't wait for him to choose the time. We set it for him. That single sentence solidified my plan. I moved Becca to Naomi's house that night. She protested, insisting she didn't want to run away. But I reminded her this wasn't retreat, it was tactical relocation. I needed her safe so I could focus. She hugged me before she left, whispering, "Don't do anything crazy." "I won't," I said. But in my mind, I was already preparing the battlefield. The next morning, I began transforming my home into a trap quietly, methodically, with the precision of a woman who'd prepared more ambushes than she could count. I installed extra locks on the windows, reinforced the back door, and repositioned the cameras Naomi had set up. Every entry point was covered, every angle documented. Then came the bait. I used one of Becca's old phones, the one Eric used to message constantly. With Naomi's help, I typed a short message and sent it to his number. "I just want to talk. Can we meet?" It was simple, believable, and guaranteed to stir him into motion. Naomi frowned as she read the message. "You sure about this? You're giving him an opening." "That's the point," I said. "He's impulsive. He won't think straight if he believes she's reaching out. And when he comes here looking for her, I'll be waiting." Naomi studied my face for a moment, then nodded. "All right, Captain, but I'm staying nearby. You call the moment he shows up." By sundown, everything was in place. I dimmed the lights in the house, sat in the living room with my old service flashlight in one hand and my phone in the other, and waited. The air felt heavy, charged like the stillness before a storm. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. Every creak of the house made me tense. Every gust of wind against the window made my hand tighten around the flashlight. I had faced insurgents in foreign lands, but nothing compared to the dread of waiting for the monster who had hurt your child to walk through your door. Then I heard it. A soft rustle outside. The faint crunch of gravel beneath cautious feet. My pulse slowed, not sped up. Adrenaline, sharp and steady, replaced fatigue. I turned off the small lamp beside me, plunging the room into darkness. The only light came from the security monitor, flickering faintly as a shadow moved across the front yard. He was here. Through the screen, I watched him approach the porch. He wore a hoodie, hood pulled low, trying to look unrecognizable, but I knew that posture, the same swagger that once fooled my daughter into believing he was gentle. He tested the doorknob once, then again. When it didn't open, he moved to the side window. The faint sound of a crowbar scraping against the frame made my stomach clench, but I didn't move yet. Patience. Timing was everything. Finally, the sound of breaking glass pierced the night. My breathing slowed to a whisper. I rose from the couch, every movement deliberate, and stepped into the hallway. My boots were silent on the hardwood floor. I positioned myself in the shadows by the entryway, where the light from the porch barely reached. He climbed through the window, careful but ungraceful. His breathing was heavy, uneven. He thought he was in control again. He thought he was hunting. But he was wrong. The moment his shoes hit the floor, I clicked on the flashlight and shone it directly into his eyes. He flinched, throwing an arm up. "Looking for someone?" I said, my voice low and calm. He froze, blinking into the light. When he realized it was me, his expression twisted into something between anger and disbelief. "What the hell, Sandra? Where's Becca?" "She's safe," I said simply. "You won't find her here." He took a step toward me, and I raised my hand slightly, not in threat, but in command. "Don't move," I warned. The authority in my tone stopped him mid-step. For a moment, he seemed uncertain, as if he didn't know whether to shout or retreat. That hesitation told me everything. The power he once held was gone. The soldier in me had come fully alive again. When he finally broke in, he had no idea what kind of battle he'd walked into. He kicked open the door and froze when he saw me standing there. The flashlight beam caught his face squarely, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw fear flicker behind his eyes. He wasn't expecting me. He was expecting Becca small, scared, compliant Becca. Not me. Not the woman standing before him in a pressed military uniform with her shoulders squared and her voice cold as steel. "Close the door behind you, Eric," I said. He hesitated, then kicked it shut out of instinct. I could see the sweat glistening on his temple, his jaw clenched tight. "Where is she?" he barked. "Where's my wife?" "She's not your wife anymore," I said evenly. "And she's safe. That's all you need to know." He took another step forward, his chest puffed out like a cornered animal trying to look bigger than it really was. "You think you can keep her from me? You think this," he gestured toward my uniform, "means anything? You're playing soldier in your own living room, Sandra." Pathetic. His attempt to provoke me didn't land. My training had taught me how to face men who yelled to mask their fear. My pulse stayed steady. My grip on the flashlight didn't waver. I didn't need to shout. My silence spoke louder. "Eric," I said, my tone low and deliberate, "this isn't about power anymore. It's about consequence." He laughed, but it came out jagged. "Consequence? What consequence? You think anyone's going to believe you? You've been stalking me, harassing me, sending me notes. Yeah, I know it was you." I didn't flinch. "We didn't send you notes, Eric. We sent you warnings. You just chose not to listen." He took another step closer, his voice dropping to a hiss. "You're going to regret this." That was when Naomi stepped out of the shadows from the adjoining room. Her phone in hand. Camera light blinking red. "Already recording, sweetheart," she said coolly. Eric spun toward her, startled. Who the hell are you?" "Back up," she replied. His face turned crimson. "You think this is some kind of joke?" I didn't respond. Instead, I lowered the flashlight beam and took one deliberate step closer. "Here's the thing about men like you," I said. "You mistake silence for submission. You think a woman's fear is respect. But all you've ever done is reveal what kind of coward you are." "Coward?" he snapped, stepping closer again. "Say that again." I met his gaze, unflinching. "Coward." He lunged. But before he could close the distance, I sidestepped, pivoted, and pressed my hand against his shoulder, using his own momentum to send him crashing into the wall. The sound echoed through the house. I didn't hit him, I didn't need to. Years of combat training had taught me that control was more powerful than brute strength. He stumbled, stunned, glaring at me from the floor. "You crazy. Careful," Naomi said, her voice sharp as she circled him. "Every word you say is being recorded. Every threat, every insult. Keep going, you're building your own case file." Eric's chest heaved as he tried to rise. "You can't do this. You can't." "I already have," I interrupted, my tone measured and cold. "There's enough evidence to put you away for years. The police are on their way right now. This conversation, it's the final chapter." He froze, his expression shifting from fury to panic. "You called them?" "I didn't have to," Naomi said, gesturing toward her phone. "The moment you broke in, the motion sensors triggered an automatic alert. You're on every camera in this house." Eric looked between us, his bravado crumbling. "You think you've won?" "No," I said softly. "I think my daughter is free. That's enough." He stood there, shoulders heaving, eyes darting between the two of us. The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, faint, but getting closer. He turned toward the window, as if considering escape, but Naomi's stance stopped him cold. She didn't move, didn't speak. Just the quiet certainty of someone who wasn't going to let him take another step. The red and blue lights flashed across the front windows a moment later. The knock on the door came hard and fast. "Police, open up!" I stepped forward, opening the door just wide enough for 2 officers to enter. They took one look at Eric, sweating, trembling, and cornered, and immediately ordered him to the ground. He resisted for half a second before reality hit. The cuffs clicked around his wrists with a sound that, to me, was more satisfying than any victory I'd ever earned in uniform. As they let him out, he glanced back at me, eyes burning with a mix of anger and disbelief. "You'll regret this," he spat. "No," I said quietly. "You will." The door shut behind them, leaving the house in silence again. The tension drained from my body all at once, my knees nearly buckling from the adrenaline crash. Naomi caught my arm before I fell. "Breathe, Captain," she said gently. "It's over." I nodded, though it didn't feel real yet. The flashing lights outside illuminated the living room like strobe bursts from a distant war zone. I looked down at the uniform. I was still wearing the same one that had seen me through chaos half a world away, and realized it had carried me through this too. When Becca arrived later that night, escorted by a police officer, she ran straight into my arms. She sobbed against my shoulder, whispering over and over, "It's really over, isn't it?" I stroked her hair and said the only thing I truly believed in that moment. "Yes, sweetheart. It's over." For the first time in months, I felt the kind of peace that doesn't come from silence, but from justice. The look of fear in his eyes was the justice I'd been waiting for. But the story didn't end with his arrest, it ended with my daughter's healing. The night Eric was taken away, the silence that followed felt sacred. When the patrol car's taillights disappeared down the road, the world outside seemed to exhale. The steady hum of the sirens faded into the distance, replaced by the rustle of trees and the faint chirp of crickets. For the first time in months, my home didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like a sanctuary again. Naomi stayed for a while, making sure the report was filed correctly and that the officers had everything they needed. She moved quietly, methodical as ever, double-checking that all the footage had been backed up and logged. When she finally looked at me, there was pride in her eyes, a quiet acknowledgement between 2 women who had seen too much and survived anyway. "You did it, Sandra," she said softly. "No," I replied. "We did." She smiled faintly, squeezed my shoulder, and left for the night. The moment the door closed, I sank into the couch, still wearing my uniform, staring at nothing. The adrenaline had drained out of me, leaving behind exhaustion so deep it ached. I wanted to cry, but the tears didn't come. Maybe I had shed too many already. Becca was asleep in the guest room, her breathing steady, peaceful. I walked to her doorway and stood there for a long time, watching her. The faint moonlight caught her face, and I realized something I hadn't seen in months. She looked young again. The tension in her jaw, the guardedness in her eyes, it was gone. For the first time, she wasn't living in fear. The next morning, The police called to confirm that Eric was being held without bail until his hearing. I thanked them, hung up, and finally allowed myself to breathe. I brewed coffee, sat on the porch, and let the sunrise wash over me. The world kept turning. The air smelled like rain and earth. Life was still possible. Later that day, Becca joined me outside, wrapped in a blanket, a mug of tea in her hands. "Mom," she said quietly, "I don't know what I would have done without you." I smiled, but my heart ached at the truth of it. "You'd have found a way. You're stronger than you think," she shook her head. "No, you saved me." I didn't argue, but deep down, I knew saving her wasn't enough. Healing had to come next. And that was something no one could do for her. She had to take that step herself. So, we started small. I helped her call her therapist, setting up regular sessions. She reached out to old friends she hadn't spoken to in months. I encouraged her to go for walks, to journal, to cook again, the simple, grounding things that remind a person they're still here, still living. Every day, she seemed a little lighter. Every night, her laughter came a little easier. Meanwhile, Naomi and I compiled the last of the evidence into a single digital folder labeled Justice for Becca. We sent copies to the district attorney's office and Lieutenant Harris. Everything was clean, airtight, undeniable. Eric's own arrogance had built the case against him. A week later, the hearing came. I didn't want Becca to face him, but she insisted. "I need to see it end," she said. We sat in the courtroom, side by side. When Eric was led in, his wrists bound, his once confident posture was gone. He looked smaller, somehow drained, pale, cornered. For months, he had controlled every room he walked into, but now the only sound was the clink of his handcuffs and the steady voice of the judge reading his charges. Becca reached for my hand. Her grip was strong, not trembling. I looked at her and saw the woman she was becoming again, not the broken one he had tried to create. When it came time for her statement, she stood and faced him. Her voice wavered at first, but then it grew stronger. She spoke about the fear, the isolation, the pain, and then, about the freedom she had reclaimed. I watched as the courtroom held its breath, everyone captivated by her calm defiance. Eric didn't speak. He didn't have the courage. When it was over, Becca sat down, tears in her eyes but relief in her smile. "It's done," she whispered. I squeezed her hand. "Yes, it is." That night, we came home to a quiet house, the air finally free of tension. Naomi joined us for dinner, and for the first time, our laughter filled the space where fear had once lived. We ate, talked, and allowed ourselves the luxury of normalcy. Later, when Becca went to bed, Naomi and I sat outside, sipping tea under the stars. The air was crisp, the night still. "You know," she said, "I've seen a lot of strong women, but what you did? That was something else." I shook my head. "No. It wasn't strength. It was love. And sometimes, love looks like war." Naomi smiled, her eyes glinting in the dark. "Maybe so. But you won this one, Captain." I didn't respond right away. I looked up at the sky. The constellations scattered like tiny metals across the darkness, and let the weight of her words settle. The war was over, but the healing that was just beginning. But when Becca took the stand, something incredible happened that I didn't expect. She forgave him, not for him, but for herself. Hearing my daughter say, "I forgive you," changed everything inside me. When Becca said those words in court, time seemed to stop. The words weren't loud or dramatic, they were quiet, measured, trembling, but they carried more power than anything else that had been spoken that day. I sat there, hands clasped in my lap, staring at my daughter as she faced the man who had broken her, the man I had spent months fighting against, and she told him she forgave him. At first, I didn't understand it. My body tensed, as if she'd betrayed herself. Forgiveness felt like surrender to me, like weakness. After everything he'd done, the bruises, the threats, fear, I couldn't comprehend how she could let those words leave her lips. But then I saw her expression. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't shrinking. She looked peaceful. That was when I realized forgiveness wasn't for him, it was her final act of taking her power back. After the hearing, She walked out of the courtroom with her head high, the autumn sunlight spilling across her face. The air felt different, lighter. I followed her down the courthouse steps, still trying to process what I had witnessed. She turned to me, smiling faintly, and said, "I needed to say it, Mom. I needed to let it go." I nodded, though my throat was tight. "You're stronger than I ever was at your age," I told her. She shook her head. "No, Mom. I'm strong because of you." We didn't talk about Eric much after that. The sentencing was scheduled, and I knew he would serve time for what he'd done. But for Becca and me, the focus had shifted. Our lives no longer revolved around him. We were free to rebuild. Weeks passed, and the heaviness in our house began to lift. Becca spent her mornings volunteering at a women's shelter downtown, helping others who had gone through similar situations. She said she wanted to make sure no one felt as alone as she once did. Seeing her give back, watching her reclaim her confidence, it was like watching a flower bloom in spring after a brutal winter. As for me, I found myself relearning peace. I still woke early, still checked the locks before bed, habits I couldn't quite shake. But I also started to rediscover the simple things: the smell of coffee brewing in the morning, the sound of birds outside my window, the quiet warmth of knowing my daughter was safe. The day Eric was sentenced, the courtroom was quieter than before. There were no tears from Becca this time, no tension, just resolve. The judge read the charges: assault, harassment, violation of a restraining order, and delivered a sentence that would keep him behind bars for years. When the gavel fell, Becca reached for my hand again. "That's justice," she whispered. I nodded, though inside I felt something shift. Justice was necessary. Yes. But peace, that was something else entirely. As we left the courthouse, the press was waiting. Microphones and cameras lined the steps, reporters shouting questions we had no interest in answering. "Mrs. Miles, how does it feel to see your son-in-law convicted?" "Becca, do you have any message for other women in your position?" Becca hesitated, looking at me. I gave her a small nod. She stepped forward and spoke clearly. "My message is simple. No woman should ever be afraid to ask for help, and no mother should ever have to fight alone." Her voice didn't waver once. That line made headlines the next morning. Her photo was on the front page of the local paper, and for the first time, her name wasn't tied to fear or victimhood, it was tied to courage. Messages started pouring in. Women from all over the state reached out to us, thanking her for speaking up. Some shared their own stories. Some just said thank you, and nothing more. Each one felt like a tiny piece of healing for both of us. One afternoon, while sorting through the letters, Becca looked at me and said, "I think I want to do more, Mom. Not just tell my story, help others tell theirs." I smiled. "Then that's what we'll do." Together, we began volunteering at the shelter where she worked. I taught basic self-defense and situational awareness. Becca helped organize group sessions for survivors. The women who came through those doors carried pain, yes, but they also carried resilience. Watching them connect, support one another, and start over reminded me that strength takes many forms. Forgiveness, justice, healing, they weren't separate paths. They were threads of the same tapestry, and Becca was weaving hers with grace. One evening, after a long day at the shelter, we sat on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon. Becca rested her head on my shoulder and whispered, "I don't hate him anymore." I looked out at the fading light, the soft hum of crickets filling the air. "You don't have to," I said. "Hate's heavy. You've carried it long enough." She smiled faintly. "You're right, I just want to live now." I kissed the top of her head and felt something in me finally unclench. I'd spent so long in battle mode that I'd forgotten what it felt like to simply be. Watching my daughter heal taught me that peace doesn't come from fighting harder, it comes from knowing when to stop. Watching her transform pain into purpose became my greatest victory. But I wasn't done serving, not yet. Justice lit a fire in me I hadn't felt since my days in uniform. After Eric's sentencing, I thought I'd finally be able to settle into quiet again, gardening, reading, enjoying the peace I'd fought so hard to restore. But that wasn't what happened. Every letter, Every message from women thanking Becca for her bravery ignited something inside me. I realized that what we'd done for ourselves couldn't end there. There were too many others, mothers, daughters, sisters still living in silence, and I couldn't walk away knowing that. One evening, as Becca and I sorted through more letters at the kitchen table, I said, "You know, there has to be a better system than this. People shouldn't have to fight alone to get justice." Becca looked up from the stack in her hands. "What are you thinking?" I leaned back in my chair. "I'm thinking it's time I serve again. Not the military this time, something different. Something that helps women who can't call for help without fear." Her eyes lit up. "Like a foundation?" "More like a mission," I said with a smile. "We'll call it Operation Safe Haven." The name came naturally. It wasn't about war, it was about protection. The goal was simple: create a network for women to find safety, resources, and confidence. My years in service had taught me logistics, structure, leadership, all the tools I'd need to build something real. And Becca had compassion, communication, and the ability to connect with others through shared pain. Together, we were unstoppable. I reached out to Naomi first. She didn't even let me finish explaining before she said, "I'm in." Within a week, she was helping me design a program that combined personal safety training, legal guidance, and emotional support. She even pulled a few strings with contacts in law enforcement to set up partnerships. Our small town rallied faster than I ever expected. A local community center offered us space to host weekly workshops. Retired veterans volunteered to help with self-defense classes. A lawyer Naomi knew donated her time to provide free legal advice for women seeking restraining orders. Becca managed the outreach, creating brochures, social media pages, and online resources. Her story had given her credibility, and women began to reach out almost immediately. Some just wanted to talk. Others needed a safe place to stay for a few nights. We didn't have all the answers, but we listened, we acted, and we grew. It was exhausting at first. I found myself waking up at dawn again, just like during my service years. But this time, my mission wasn't across an ocean, it was in my own community. And the victories, though smaller, felt just as meaningful. Each woman who walked through our door carried the same look I'd seen in Becca's eyes that first night. Fear mixed with shame. But when they left, there was something else: hope. Word spread. Within 3 months, Operation Safe Haven had expanded beyond our county. We built partnerships with nearby shelters, trained volunteers in safety, protocols, and even developed a small fund to help women relocate discreetly when needed. Every time someone asked what drove me, I said the same thing: because no one should have to go to war inside their own home. One afternoon, Becca came to me with tears in her eyes. I immediately thought something was wrong, but she smiled as she handed me her phone. "Look," she said. It was an email from a woman in another state. She'd seen one of our videos online and had used the information we provided to escape her abusive partner safely. "You saved my life," the email read. "I don't even know you, but thank you." I had to sit down after reading that. It hit me harder than any medal or commendation I'd ever received. It meant the mission mattered. Naomi started jokingly calling me Commander Mom, and the nickname stuck. We printed it on mugs for our volunteers. Laughter began to fill our days instead of tension. Even Becca started to shine again. She'd go from speaking at local schools to mentoring women who'd survived similar situations. Watching her transform pain into strength was like watching the light come back into a room after years of darkness. One evening, as we were packing up after a long day of training, Becca said, "Mom, do you ever miss it? The army?" I thought for a moment before answering. "No. I thought I did for a long time, but I realize now that what I miss isn't the uniform, it's the purpose. And this is purpose." She nodded thoughtfully. "Then I guess we're still serving, just in a different kind of war." I smiled. "Exactly." We locked up the center that night. The air crisp and quiet. The sky full of stars. I felt content in a way I hadn't in years. But as we walked toward the car, I noticed a woman waiting by the entrance. She looked hesitant, her hands clasped in front of her. "Can I help you?" I asked gently. She stepped closer, her eyes shining with recognition. "You're Sandra Miles, right?" "Yes," I said. "How can I help?" She took a shaky breath. "My name's Jenna." The name hit me like a spark in dry tinder. Jenna, the woman who had once loved Eric before Becca. The one who had run and vanished into another life. Becca froze beside me. Jenna's voice trembled as she said, "I saw the news about your program. I needed to see you in person." I swallowed hard, motioning her inside. "Of course, come in." As she stepped through the door, I knew something important was about to unfold. But one unexpected visitor made it personal again. Jenna, Eric's ex, walked into our office one afternoon with a story that shattered me. Jenna's story was the missing chapter of Eric's cruelty. When Jenna stepped into the office, the energy in the room changed. She was younger than I expected, mid-30s maybe, but her eyes carried the same weight I'd seen in Becca's months ago. Fear, exhaustion, shame, and something else, guilt. She stood just inside the doorway, clutching a small purse like it was the only solid thing keeping her upright. Becca was the first to move. "You're Jenna?" she asked softly. Jenna nodded. "I'm sorry for showing up unannounced. I saw the news about what you both have been doing. I almost didn't come, but I think you deserve to hear the truth about what he really did." We led her to a chair, poured her some water, and gave her time to gather herself. It was a routine I knew by heart. Now give space. Don't rush the story. Let the silence do the comforting. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked like old glass. "I thought I could fix him," she said. "That's what I told myself back then. He wasn't always awful. At first, he was charming, sweet, attentive. He'd buy flowers, send long messages, tell me I was the only one who understood him." Becca's hands tightened on her lap. I stayed quiet, letting Jenna's words spill out, like poison that had waited years to be released. "It started small," she continued. "Little criticisms. The way I dressed. Who I talked to. Then came the shouting, the guilt trips, the long stretches where he'd disappear just to punish me, and when I tried to leave." She paused, tears brimming. "He locked me in the apartment one night, took my phone. Said if I ever told anyone he'd make me pay for it," Becca gasped softly, and I felt a cold fury bloom in my chest. I had known Eric was dangerous, but hearing this, the full picture solidified just how calculated his cruelty was. Jenna went on. "I called the police once, but when they came, he acted calm, sweet even. Said I was overreacting, that I'd had too much to drink. I thought they'd see through him, but they didn't. They left, and I realized no one would help me. So, I ran. I quit my job, changed my name, moved across state lines. I've been looking over my shoulder ever since." Her voice broke completely. Becca reached across the table and took her hand. "You don't have to run anymore," she said softly. "He can't hurt you now." Jenna shook her head. "I know. But he still lives in my head, you know? Every time I close a door too loud. Every time I hear a man raise his voice. It's like he's still there." I understood that. Trauma leaves echoes, it doesn't fade easily. We spent hours talking. Jenna told us everything. How Eric had isolated her from friends, manipulated her family, and threatened to ruin her life. She'd once tried to warn one of his co-workers' girlfriends, but fear had silenced her. When she saw the news about Becca's case and Operation Safe Haven, she said she finally felt safe enough to come forward. At one point, she reached into her purse and pulled out an old USB drive. "This," she said, sliding it across the table, "is from the security camera at the apartment building we lived in. I kept it all these years, just in case. I couldn't watch it myself, but maybe it'll help someone else." I hesitated before taking it. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "I trust you." That trust felt heavier than any burden I'd carried before. Later that evening, after Jenna left, Becca and I plugged the drive into the office computer. Naomi joined us, her expression grim. The footage was grainy, black and white, but clear enough. It showed Eric pacing, shouting, slamming doors. One clip captured him grabbing Jenna by the arm, forcing her into their apartment. I had to look away. When the video ended, the room was silent. Naomi exhaled slowly. That man should have been stopped years ago. He is now, I said, though my voice sounded hollow. But how many others like him are still out there? That question lingered in the air, heavier than any answer we could give. Jenna came back the next day, not as a victim but as someone determined to help. She said she wanted to volunteer, teach other survivors how to document, protect, and rebuild their lives. It was her way of reclaiming her power. I saw the same spark in her that I'd seen in Becca when she began to heal. Together, the three of us, me, Becca, and Jenna, became something I hadn't expected. A unit. We started hosting small survivor meetups every week, where women could share stories without fear or judgment. The room that once echoed with pain began to fill with laughter and support. Becca and Jenna grew close quickly. They shared similar scars, similar memories, but instead of letting those bind them to the past, they used them as fuel for change. Watching them side by side was like watching two halves of a broken mirror come together, not perfect, but whole enough to reflect light again. One afternoon, I watched them lead a group session, both of them confident and calm, and something in my chest loosened. This was what justice truly looked like. Not revenge, not punishment, but healing that multiplied. When the last woman left that day, Jenna turned to me and said, "You know, if you hadn't stood up to him, none of this would have happened. You didn't just save Becca, you saved me too." Her words stopped me cold. For months, I'd been so focused on protecting my daughter that I hadn't realized how far the ripples of our fight had spread. That night, I sat alone in the office, looking at the framed photo on my desk. Me, Becca, and Naomi in our uniforms from years ago. I realized that my mission hadn't ended when I took off the uniform. It had simply evolved. For the first time, I saw the full circle of justice complete itself. And yet, I still felt one final chapter of my own story waiting to be written. When a local news station invited me to share our journey, I almost said no. For months, I'd avoided attention. The mission was never about publicity, it was about survival, justice, and rebuilding lives. But when the reporter called, her voice trembling with emotion as she said, "Your work has saved women across the state. People need to hear your story." Something inside me hesitated. Maybe, I thought, if our story could reach one more mother, one more daughter before it was too late, then maybe it was worth stepping into the light. I told Becca about the invitation over coffee the next morning. She looked both surprised and proud. "Mom, you have to do it. Tell them what we've done, what you've done. People trust you. They'll listen." I shook my head. "This isn't just my story. It's yours too. I don't want the focus to be on revenge or violence. I want it to be about resilience." "That's exactly why you should speak," she said, her eyes soft but steady. "Because you didn't just fight for me, you fought for every woman who thought she couldn't fight for herself." So I agreed. The station sent a crew a few days later, setting up cameras in the community center that had become our base of operations. The lights were bright, the microphones intrusive, but I kept reminding myself why I was there. The interviewer, a young woman named Tara, asked thoughtful questions, never pushing too hard. She wanted to know how it started, how I found the strength, and what I'd learned. "It started the night I saw my daughter's bruises," I said. "That was the moment I remembered who I used to be and realized I could be that person again for her." Tara nodded. "And what would you say to mothers or survivors watching this who feel powerless?" I looked straight into the camera, my voice calm but resolute. "Powerlessness isn't real, it's something fear convinces you of. The truth is, strength doesn't always look like fighting back with fists. Sometimes, it's calling for help. Sometimes, it's leaving. Sometimes, it's standing in front of your child and saying, 'Not anymore.'" When the interview ended, Tara looked at me quietly for a moment and said, "You know, that's going to change lives." I smiled faintly. That's the goal. The segment aired 3 days later. I wasn't prepared for what followed. The story went viral within hours, shared, reposted, discussed on forums and community boards across the country. Messages flooded our inbox again, but this time, they weren't just from survivors. They were from police officers, Teachers, counselors, even fathers, people who wanted to help, who wanted to be part of Operation Safe Haven. It was overwhelming, humbling, and bittersweet all at once. Naomi joked that I'd become a celebrity general, but beneath her humor, I saw her pride. Becca's eyes lit up every time someone new reached out. The movement had grown far beyond what we'd imagined. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings and calls, Becca found me sitting alone in the office. I was staring at a map on the wall pins marking every Safe Haven branch that had opened since we started. There were 22 now, stretching across 3 states. "You okay?" she asked. I nodded slowly. "Just thinking. When this began, I was fighting one man. Now, it feels like I'm fighting an entire culture of silence." Becca sat beside me, resting her hand on mine. "Then we keep fighting until it's gone." Her words filled me with a kind of warmth I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't the rush of battle, it was the quiet fulfillment that comes from purpose. I realized that the war I was waging now wasn't against a person. It was against fear itself. A few weeks later, we hosted our first regional Safe Haven conference. Survivors, advocates, and volunteers filled a rented hall. The energy in that room was electric, people hugging, crying, laughing, sharing their stories freely. When it was my turn to speak, I stood behind the podium and looked at the sea of faces, each one carrying their own version of Becca's pain and strength. "I used to think revenge was the only justice," I told them. "But I've learned that real justice is breaking the cycle, teaching our daughters to fight, our sons to respect, and ourselves to never stay silent." The applause that followed wasn't loud, it was steady, rhythmic, and full of meaning. After the event, Becca hugged me tightly. "Mom," she whispered, "you did it. You turned something awful into something good." I smiled, tears stinging my eyes. "We did it." That night, I went home feeling lighter than I had in a long time. I sat on the porch, the cool air brushing against my face, and thought about the journey, the uniform, the pain, the justice, the healing. My life had come full circle, and that realization changed how I saw my past, my pain, and my purpose. But one letter in the mail would test my peace all over again. The letter came from Eric himself. It arrived on a Thursday afternoon, tucked between utility bills and community flyers. The return address caught my eye immediately, the name of the state penitentiary, printed neatly in black ink. For a long moment, I just stood there on the porch, staring at it, my thumb pressed against the seal. I could almost hear Naomi's voice in my head. "You don't owe him your attention." She'd be right. Of course. But something in me needed to see what he had to say. Closure. Maybe. Or curiosity. Or just the simple human need to know that the past truly understood it had lost. I took the letter inside, sat at the kitchen table, and unfolded it carefully. The paper was thin, the handwriting surprisingly neat. The first line made me exhale through my teeth. "Sandra, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even expect you to read this. But I want you to know I think about what happened every day." I read on, my eyes scanning the words like they were written by a stranger. He talked about his time in therapy, how the counselors had forced him to confront his anger, his father's abuse, his years of denial. He wrote about sleepless nights, about facing the man he'd become. Then came the part that caught in my throat. "You stopped me before I destroyed more lives. I used to see myself as the victim. Now I know I was the monster. I'm not asking for redemption, I just wanted to thank you for stopping me." I set the letter down and stared at it for a long while. I wanted to feel anger, triumph, something clean and simple. But instead, what I felt was exhaustion. The war was over. I didn't need to carry the weight of his guilt anymore. That belonged to him now. When Becca came home later that evening, she found me still sitting there. "What's that?" she asked. "From Eric," I said quietly. Her body stiffened. "What does he want?" "Nothing," I replied. "Just words. He says he's sorry." She hesitated. "Do you believe him?" I folded the letter neatly and looked out the window at the sunset bleeding across the sky. Belief isn't the point anymore. Whether he's sorry or not, doesn't change what we've built. We moved on. That's what matters. Becca nodded slowly, her expression softening. "What are you going to do with it?" I stood, walked to the back door, and stepped outside. The air was cool, crisp with the smell of wood smoke. I set the letter in the fire pit, struck a match, and watched as the paper curled and blackened. The words, his apologies, his memories, all of it turned to ash in seconds. The flames danced briefly, then faded to glowing embers. Becca joined me, slipping her hand into mine. Together, we watched the last of the smoke disappear into the darkening sky. "You did the right thing," she said softly. "Maybe," I replied. "Or maybe I just did what I needed to." We stood there in silence for a while. The world felt still, calm, the kind of calm that isn't fragile anymore but earned. Inside the house, the phone buzzed with messages, reminders, responsibilities. The mission never really ended. But for tonight, it could wait. A few weeks later, Operation Safe Haven received a grant that would allow us to expand statewide. Becca was thrilled, already planning new branches, new partnerships. Naomi was coordinating with veterans to provide security and defense training for survivors. Life moved forward, strong and steady. At the next board meeting, Becca stood to make an announcement. "We've helped over 1,000 women this year," she said proudly. "And it all started with one person deciding she couldn't stand by and watch anymore." She turned to me. "That person is my mom." The room erupted in applause. But I just smiled, humbled and grateful. I didn't start this for recognition. I started it because one act of violence had awakened something in me, a reminder that strength, when tempered by compassion, could become a force greater than fear. After the meeting, as the crowd dispersed, Naomi approached me. "You ever think you'd end up here?" she asked with a grin. I laughed softly. "Not in a million years." She tilted her head. "Any regrets?" I looked around the bustling office, the volunteers, the survivors, the hope that filled the walls, and then at my daughter, smiling as she spoke to a new member. "Not one," I said. "Every scar, every sleepless night, every choice led us here. And here is good." Later that night, I walked out to the porch again, the stars bright above me. The old uniform hung framed in the hallway now, retired for good. It wasn't just a symbol of war anymore, it was a reminder that duty doesn't always mean fighting enemies abroad. Sometimes, it means standing your ground at home, protecting what's sacred, and teaching others to do the same. Becca joined me, a mug of tea in her hands. "You know," she said, smiling softly, "I think Dad would be proud of you." I looked at her, my throat tightening. "I think he'd be proud of us." She nodded, leaning against my shoulder. We stayed like that, two women shaped by pain but defined by resilience, watching the night stretch endlessly ahead. The world wasn't perfect. There would always be more battles to fight, more women to protect, more stories to tell. But I wasn't afraid of them anymore. I had purpose. I had peace. I had my daughter. And as the wind carried the last traces of smoke away, I whispered the words I'd come to live by. Justice gave us freedom, but love gave us peace. The uniform I once wore for war had become a symbol of protection and hope. And though the battles change, a mother's duty to protect never truly ends.